So starting off today, the segue of um, civilization or chaos. This is page 30. My father believed that the sayings of Jesus were written down at an early date after his death in Aramaic, as a moral manual was needed by his followers. But he, along with other patristic scholars, conclusively proved that the Gospels were not written down before 70 to 120 AD, being compilations of earlier records. Then again, the authors of the first and third Gospels appropriated the text and matter of the second Gospel, and the writer of the fourth Gospel is unknown. This exploded the traditional view held at the end of the 19th century. Recently, patristic scholars have found, quote, hundreds of differences, end quote, between the wording of the more than 2,000 years old book of Isaiah, found along with other priceless manuscripts of the same date, in 12 vases in a cave in Palestine in 1947. And the King James Version of the Bible. So that's between the wording of the more than 2,000 years old book of Isaiah and the King James Version of the Bible. Hence, the facility with which people have interpreted the Bible as they please, and they still do. It is difficult to know exactly what the biblical prophets said when we have not got the original text, because it has been changed over and over again by different translators and writers, working after the manner my father has described. Still, it is very gratifying to know that the basic messages of the original writings of Isaiah do appear to have come down more or less intact. The most important of all discoveries was the finding of a number of Coptic manuscripts near Luxor in Egypt in 1945. The writings in question had not seen the light of day for well over 1,800 years. They were found in an urn which had been buried in a Greco-Roman cemetery and date from about AD 150. It seems to us that all these precious documents were purposely concealed in the urn, probably by some initiate, in anticipation of their suppression by the church, since all knowledge of the Gnostic tradition was destroyed wherever possible. Therefore, may not these papyri, when translated, throw a great searchlight from antiquity on the Hermetic teachings of Jesus? For the manuscripts do not appear to have been mutilated or altered in any way by successive councils, thanks to their concealment down the centuries. May we not anticipate that some of their doctrines will prove that Gnosis was identical with the Hindu tradition of the divinity of man? For Gnostic teachings originated in the East and show clearly that Gnosis, for its initiates, was not just a theory, but a living experience. One of these documents is of inestimable importance, the papyrus volume now entitled the C.G. Jung Codex. Professor Henri Charles Puch of the Collège de France is engaged in the work of translating these writings, and he says that they are derived from the Valentinian Gnostic school. Such teachings had been lost, and scholars only possessed heresiological evidence of a very fragmentary nature. Hence, the discovery is of tremendous importance and fills a long-felt gap in historical research. We have referred in detail to the Gospel of Truth in our chapter 12, as it is based on gnosis, or ultimate recognition of the self in God, and is similar to the Eastern concept of self-revelation, so long suppressed by Christian orthodoxy. Marian, would you like to continue?
Yes. Let me. People inherit their religious beliefs without troubling to understand them. In any case, students of the Bible must be aware of the innumerable contradictions and unreliability of the Old Testament. But certainly in the New Testament, in spite of discrepancy and deliberate later interpolations, there are fewer contradictions and a much higher ethical approach, showing a distinct spiritual development since the days of Moses. And there's a footnote. Moses lived about 1460 BC, and after his death, about 4 centuries lapsed before the events of his lifetime were inscribed. Still, we should realize that we can learn much from the great stories of the Old Testament, and they show a pattern, as if God were shaping the history of Israel. Then again, let's see.
Oh, sorry, I went too far. There we go.
Then again, mistakes are less frequent because of the high level of inspiration and because writers were dealing with events with which they themselves were familiar. But all thinking people must be aware of the questionable ethics of the Old Testament. Let us take at random one passage in 1 Samuel 15, 1-4, God is represented as having ordered the massacre of the entire tribe of the Amalekites, including little children and even animals, for an offense committed by their ancestors 400 years before, when the Israelites were escaping from the land of Egypt. The Old Testament also shows that some writers were hazy about the nature of God and the devil. For if 1 Chronicles 21 be compared with 2 Samuel 24, 1, we even find different writers attributing the same action in one case to the devil, and in the other case to God. My brother and I were not allowed to read the Old Testament when we were children, and I remember a horrified peep in which I discovered that Jehovah enjoyed the sweet savor and burnt offerings of sacrificial animals in much the same manner as the gods of present-day savages are supposed to be propitiated by the blood and reek of their victims. Nevertheless, we have to remember that some of the great masters and initiates who contributed to the biblical records had scientific knowledge only verified many centuries later. For example, the fact that the earth was round and not flat was known to Isaiah. Quote, "It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth." End quote. Chapter XL, verse 22. But do not forget that even at the end of the 13th century, Marcion's influence remained so great that many thousands of Cathars, as they were called, perished at the stake all over Europe for affirming that the Old Testament was inspired by an evil demiurge. Here's a footnote. Marcion was a converted pagan of the 2nd century, and according to my father, the greatest anti-Semite of antiquity. The church burned these good people, but was so much shamed by their arguments that the Bible was withdrawn as much as possible from the laity. Later on, to quote again from Myth, Magic, and Morals, quote, "The so-called reformers of the 16th century, having divorced themselves from the unity of the Catholic Church and being in quest of some authority upon which to base their teachings and discipline, tried to substitute the Bible for the Pope. And thousands of misguided people still imagine that the ends of piety are served by thrusting barbarous translations of the Pentateuch into the hands of savages. Educated Anglicans, however, are visibly uncomfortable about it and realize it is hardly appropriate for their white-robed choirs of small boys to be chanting such vindictive imprecations as Psalm CXXVII.
I think that's 137.
Okay, thank you. 137, which, to take a single example, contains, "O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall be he that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones." Paren, verses 8 and 9, according to the Revised Version. My father, when discussing the theological opinion of his time, which is still accepted today, that the Bible is a record of progressive revelations, goes on to ask, quote, But if the Bible triumphed long ago over other sacred literatures, just because of its intrinsic superiority, is not that fact a good reason today for canceling in daily worship all passages redolent of the earliest and most barbarous stage of progressive revelation? The evil results of singing and reading out such literature in church and chapel must have impressed every student of the history of religion in Europe. For the persecutor has ever found in the precepts of Jahwe an armory of cruel texts, justifying by reason of their supposed divine authority the worst excesses of religious fanaticism. The bibliolatry of the Reformed churches was even less humane in its result than the sacerdotalism of Rome.
Thanks, Marian.
Thank you.
Gloria, could you continue for us?
Meanwhile, official Christianity continues to flounder in a bog of ignorance and superstition. A dean of St. Paul's wrote, quote, "The Christian idea of God is hardly likely to be the religion of the future. If its defenders feel obliged to ignore or minimize every acquisition of fresh knowledge," end quote. The Orthodox churches of no matter what faith all seem to share the delusion that their dogmas are unique, although the inner construction or pattern of religion has always been identical, no matter how covered or glossed over by ritual and creeds. There can, by the nature of things and the order of the universe, be only one form of spiritual development once the aspirant has reached the path towards perfection. How can we understand men without, first of all, appreciating the inner truths and inner realities of existence, the meaning of creation, and the conditioning of the soul? If we discuss such matters with the scientist, he says this is not for him, but that we must turn to the philosophers. But what has philosophy done to turn the light on in the darkness? Academic dialectics, dominated by the intellect, have achieved little. As J.J. van der Loo wrote in his book, The Conquest of Illusion, quote, "The mystery of life is not a problem to be solved. It is a reality to be experienced," end quote. And philosophers do not, as a rule, express themselves clearly, and their theories are often hidden under a mass of verbiage. If we read ancient, medieval, and even modern views of theologians and philosophers, we can well see how people have been led to believe in a mass of contradictions. The human mind, as long as it is under the spell of the illusory nature of this universe, can never do more than make conjectures. It can never arrive at any definite conclusions, and so the problems of whence and whither remain insoluble mysteries. Only when the mind has transcended its limitations and man has become perfect in all comprehensions can he arrive at truth, which is beyond the scope of the intellect and brain. It is useless for academicians to discuss truth without verifying the facts at their source, and this can only be found in an incarnation or personification of truth, Satya Hake, as it is called in the East. That is to say, in one known as a perfect master, Sadguru or Kutu. Only now are the hidden teachings again beginning to spread, but unfortunately confused with much that is irrelevant and rubbish. It is not to be wondered that the scholar, ever mindful of his personal integrity, looks askance at esoteric wisdom and Kabbalistic formulae. This is for the anthropologist, say he. But here we should point out that the work of the anthropologist is concerned only with the crude and early stage of man's development, whereas mystical lore belongs to the return journey of man to his original homeland, the domain of the oversoul or absolute God from whence he sprang. For this reason, a mystic is a highly advanced man on his way to complete the end journey of the soul hacked to itself as the oversoul.
I guess that hack here is probably back to itself.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, just a guess. Oh, please continue for a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Gloria.
Chapter 2, what is God? If man is to be saved from his suicidal folly in a world divided into two armed camps, some form of divine intervention must take place, as we have already suggested. What can this be? It could only be a release of the Christ consciousness to change men's hearts and awaken them to a higher level of understanding. Thoughtful people all over the world feel they may be living in an avataric period or messianic age. This means that a divine personality in human form should appear to save the world and to give a new dispensation of the eternal and only truth, namely that God is love. It is thought that God must speak at the appointed hour and the Word will again be made flesh. What is an avatar or Messiah? In India, he is said to be God in human form and is known by the Sufis as the Sahib-e-Zaman, that is to say, he is a perfect man, one who has the Christ consciousness, Swayam Du Dinyan, and the Hakikat Mohammedi, or by whatever name it is known. All this means one and the same truth. Means one is with God and one is with man at one at the same time. This exalted position, according to Sufi and Vedantic tradition, handed down through the ages, is always held by the avatar or prophet of God of the particular age to which he manifests. The difference between the two aspects of the universal manifestation of divinity is due to the need for greater or lesser stress to be laid on the divinity or fatherhood of the avatar and the humanity or sonship of the prophet at a time when an old cycle is ending and a new cycle of time beginning. For example, Mohammed's patterns of life differs very distinctly from that of Jesus. The belief that man can become God incarnate, namely, that God can become man, is as old as man himself and was certainly prevalent in ancient times in the Greek play, the Bacchae, which opens with the return of Dionysius, the god, to the city of Thebes. Quote, I am Dionysius, the god, but I have changed my shape from divine to human, and now I am come to Thebes to visit the springs of Circe and the waters of Ismenus, end quote. This idea is still understood in the East, but it has been forgotten in the West. Paul said, quote, know ye not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you. The formal Indian salutation shows the Eastern understanding of this idea. The raising and joining together of the palms of the hands, manaskar, is the act of paying homage to the divinity in man. The praying hands of the Christian are doubtless a reverential attitude adapted from the Hindu tradition. For the oldest religion in recorded history, in its pristine purity, always regarded man as the temple of God.
Thank you, Gloria. Rosalie, could you unmute and continue?
Before we attempt to define the status of an avatar, we will begin by some introductory remarks on the nature of man. Quotes, made in the image and likeness of God, end quote. The quotes, likeness of God, end quote, state can only be achieved by the perfected man. Such a man is the clear channel through which the infinite spirit can flow, unrestricted by the mental limitations of ordinary man. A perfected man can also pass on this infinite power to others. This he does to those of his circle who are ready for advancement in consciousness, which coincides with his own. That is to say, those who have reached the necessary stage of advanced spiritual development. In most forms of Eastern philosophy, it is held that man carries within him the sum total of all things, the eternal verities and principles of life, which make him divine. But man remains unaware of his divinity until awakened by one who already expresses full awareness of his own divinity. Jesus gave the same teaching when he said, quotes, the kingdom of God is within you, end quote. Undoubtedly, some of the disciples of Jesus eventually became perfect themselves. They obviously discussed this question when they wondered who would be the greatest amongst them. For the avatar always appoints a, quote, spiritual charge man, end quote, to carry on the work after his death. Modern metaphysical wisdom suggests that God is within us and that there is no limit to our possibilities. Eastern and Western mysticism has always taught the ultimate union of man with his divine soul, the infinite spirit in the form of a spiritual rebirth. According to modern psychology, man is constantly striving to unite with his subconscious or feminine principle, and woman with her subconscious or masculine principle. Such a union would mean the birth of the Christ child, or, in other words, a perfectly integrated human being. A perfectly integrated man would be a perfected man. Biological discoveries have found some scientists in agreement with occultists who believe that a non-physical consciousness determines the structure of living organisms. Also, biologically, we are told there is no evidence why man should not live for thousands of years. It is said that in India, there are yogis who have seen many centuries unroll before their ageless eyes. Here's a little asterisk. That's from the Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. Our minds are rooted in the realm of mental and spiritual activity, and our brain might be compared with the receiving sets we use to listen to broadcasts. But sometimes the broadcasts suggest a very different environment from the one we know, a spiritual climb where such thoughts appear as, quotes, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," end quote. The researches of Sir Victor Horley on the human brain, along with those of other scientists, have shown that only a small section of the average brain appears to be in use. Science knows very little regarding the powers and possibilities of the human mind, for the brain remains always unexplored. As Alexis Carrel pointed out in Man the Unknown, quotes, "Science studies intensely man's liver, kidneys, and all his physical functions, everything except the only important function, which is thought," end quotes. Dr. Wilder Penfield of McGill University has done sensational work by means of electrodynamics and has revealed that the brain is the seat of a center of unimaginable complexity. His experiments make one wonder if the dormant brain cells only function in the head of one who has the universal mind. Professor Rhine of Duke University, USA, is doing specific work on the human mind, which has opened new avenues of research on the human brain. The universal consciousness is used by the perfect masters or sadgurus, who are fully awakened men, since they are untrammeled by the limitations of their sensory functions, whereas ordinary men are only partially awake, as if a veil obscured their senses. Bergson suggested in his work, Creative Evolution, that if the various innate propensities or instinctive forms of consciousness prevailing along other lines of evolution than that of man could be brought together or amalgamated with the human intellect, we might have a consciousness as wide as life, because the instinctive processes would then be articulate. Bergson's, quotes, instinct, end quotes, must not be confused with Spinoza's, quotes, intuition, end quotes, or direct knowledge. Spinoza's ethics is the link between philosophy and Christianity, and his Amor Dei Intellectualis is akin to Meher Baba's, quotes, love, end quotes. Anthropologists like Fraser in The Golden Bough have described the age-old belief in an abstract force or mana, which pervades the universe and which is the motive power of all things. And the savage or primitive man believes by the control of this force, it is possible to attune himself to nature to the extent of sending vibrations reverberating through space or the universal framework of things, thereby attaining the divine powers attributed to the man gods of primitive society. Of course, it is not to be wondered that modern thinkers are apt to put reason, intellect, and logic above all other methods of rationalization. Since we have so recently emerged from ignorance and superstition, but even materialistic philosophers like Bertrand Russell admit a certain validity for intuitive apprehension. The relation of man to God has ever been the subject of endless conjecture by the theologians of all faiths. This relation can never be solved through the intellect alone, which is bound by the limitations of the human mind, but Orthodox divines in general, while assuming that God is the supreme being, reject the idea that man can have what we might call direct knowledge of him. In other words, they oppose the principle that man can be God or that God can become man. In everything, there is a starting point. So why should man be an exception to a universal rule? One cannot get something from nothing. Without creation and incidentally man, we would be quite unaware of God. Eckhart knew when he said, God is at the center of man. The Bhagavad Gita stated the same truth. Quotes, the Lord abideth in the hearts of all beings, end quotes. The Quran asks, quotes, and he is within you. Why do you not see him? End quotes. Man must have within him the creative force which created him in the first place. Quotes, without him was not anything made that is made, end quotes. Quotes, all is of God, and God is all in all, end quote. Such a power can know no curtailment in no matter what sphere. One might say that God is only latently conscious in nature and becomes fully conscious of himself only in man's highest consciousness, which then is also divine. The great masters of the past were believed to be God incarnate by their followers. And we have the example of their chosen disciples becoming God realized. That is to say, achieving the same state of supreme consciousness. Even as men have always been made perfect throughout the centuries and today, Paul must have understood this principle when he said, quotes, I shall know even as I am known, end quotes. An Eastern saint once remarked that he did not know God till he was 70, implying that he attained to God realization at that age. The idea that God is outside and very far from poor humanity is seen in the ancient Christian conception of a distant God, seated in the heavens, sometimes with grim reminders of hell below. We see this idea in the works of the primitives and old masters. This might have been just a naive transference of the patriarchal sovereignty of a Caesar. But now, with the passing of royal prerogatives, a more modern concept of God in conformity with modern thought, is coming into existence. Certainly, compared with the former Christian impression, the gentle, intimate pictures of Krishna with his flute and the cows shows a deeper and more sympathetic treatment of God as he really is within the hearts of all of us all.
Thanks, Rosalie. Miguel, please.
Yes. Recurring Navaratic periods in history suggests the validity of the theory of reincarnation in avatars, as well as in ordinary men. In the days when Jesus lived, the theory of reincarnation was widely accepted in the East, which may be the reason why Jesus did not stress that particular principle. To open-minded students, there are hints in the Bible of a belief in former lives. Unfortunately, as the years roll by and as the death of a master recedes into the distant past, his followers build up great superstructures of religious rituals in which the inner realities and inner truths have been lost or forgotten, to be superseded by doctrine, ritual, and dogma. The secret truths have been taught in the sacred books of all ages, but they have been couched in symbolical language that could be understood only by initiates. For example, the Sefer of Moses is said to contain 3 meanings: the simple, the figurative, and the hierarchic. Only those who could penetrate the last meaning would know that the principles of life really are contained in the book of Genesis. Those who are satisfied with literal meanings and, quote, the letter that killeth, end quote, can never know, no matter how great their scholarship. Fabre d'Olivet, the French savant and initiate, who lived in the time of Napoleon and was author of The Hebraic Tongue Restored, a monumental work of learning, penetrated some of the secrets of Genesis and was able to demonstrate certain principles. The Pope of that time, objecting to miracles being performed outside the church by a layman, influenced Napoleon to have d'Olivet banished, and he was forbidden to perform any more wonders. An examination of the esoteric aspects of comparative religion reveals that there is an underlying principle which runs like a golden thread through the maze of the secret systems of thought. Here we are approaching the fundamental laws which govern humanity and, incidentally, the universe. To define the soul from what we will continue to call the esoteric approach, men consist of 3 main principles: matter, soul, and spirit. The soul, in reality, although perfect and eternal, should be regarded as a kind of intermediary which unites the physical bodies of men with his spiritual counterparts. Inayat Khan defined the soul as God's consciousness in activity. We know that God is a concept, which varies according to a man's degree of culture. People of today are sophisticated and analytical in their outlook. And if they think about the deeper aspects of the mind, they want to know precisely what is God. They are no longer content with the formulae of the churches, whether Christian or not. Analytical psychology has done good work in unwittingly paving the way for the foundations of a rationalistic study of the soul and its functions. Christian mysticism acknowledges the main stages of the path towards perfection. And the church calls these the seven heavens. Paul described how he was caught up into the third heaven. Muhammad described how he traversed the path towards perfection and experienced Miraj, allí the seventh heaven. Part of the way he rode on an animal called the Burak, which symbolizes the breath. The fact that the Burak was only able to carry the prophet a certain distance through the spheres indicates that the breath can assist only to a certain degree of attainment. The Burak is the same creature as the Sphinx. It has the body of a horse with wings and the face of a human being. The body represents the animal nature of man, and the head stands for the divine soul and ultimate perfectioning of men. There is a whole literature applying to the different faiths, in which the secret truths on the evolution of the nature of man have been taught from times immemorial, and those interested in the subject can read it for themselves. But one word of warning here: unless we can learn direct from a perfect master or those close to him, we can only get a partial and often incorrect view of the many-sided aspects of truth. Some of the great Victorian writers and philosophers are gravely answerable for their part in influencing men towards present-day atheism. For those with less intellectual arrogance and more sense of responsibility, such as the psychologists of the young school, found that a knowledge of God and his laws was essential for the well-being of patients, and indeed for balanced mankind as well. Young Constance, in his remarkable and self-revealing testament, Wisdom, Madness, and Folly, teaches us more of life by his theory of actuality, quote unquote, than do the pedagogues of conventional thought. For those who have suffered from mental disturbance and have been forced to wander in the nethermost regions of horror and fear, know that great mystics in their, quote, dark nights of the soul, end quote, have shared analogous experiences, and also with them have reached great altitudes of bliss, belonging to the higher spheres of consciousness. In fact, men like Constance and in Yerksky felt the nearness and wholeness of God when they experienced the whole universe as within themselves. They have a truer picture of life as a whole, whereas the normally sane deny unfamiliar parts, thus displaying ignorance of the deeper realities of life. As Constance writes, quote, "We are, as it were, offshoots of an eternal tree of life. And if the psychologists tell us that our ideas of a future heaven and a paradise lost in the past are regressive yearnings for the peace of the womb, what is that but to say that a part of our nature harks back to that unity with the self from which we have developed?" Constance also writes of the, quote, "strange flashes of insight," end quote, and wonders whether these states have any meaning. He says, quote, "For my own part, I am always impelled to rationalize this with the idea of an infinite life beyond time and space, in which all things are possible, and indeed all patterns are complete," end quote. It was his consciousness of relationship with God which at times helped him to conquer tendencies to depressive attacks. Religious ecstasy sometimes appears to have a striking analogy with the psychopathic states, and it is for the psychiatrist to study spiritual phenomena and the path dynamics which accompany them. Instead, they are apt to deny validity and sense to psychopathic phenomena, simply because of their lack of cognition of the deeper aspects of the human mind. But fortunately, Jung and others have influenced modern psychology to a deeper appreciation of the vast underlying fields of the subconscious. Constance also makes the interesting observation, quote, "that mystical, static, or psychopathic experiences are due to the greater freedom given to instinctive or unconscious factors. They thus provide some sort of more complete vision in the Bergsonian sense, which, in view of the limited nature and capacity of human consciousness, can only be obtained by excessive simplification and elimination of normal hindrances to rational consciousness and perception." Readers, if they seek, will find there is common ground in mysticism between all the faiths. For example, there is even a accord between Hinduism and Orthodox Catholicism. There's a footnote. C.H.O. Mascarenhas' book, The Quintessence of Hinduism, the principal of San Sebastian Gone High School, Bombay, Dr. Mascarenhas begins his introduction, quote, by stating on the authority of critical Catholic scholarship, end quote, on Hindu tradition, that it is, quote, "the most searching quest into the natural order of the divine that the world has known," end quote. He also claims, quote, "there is unity fundamental harmony, nay, basic identity between the metaphysical orthodoxy in Catholicism and Hinduism, end quote. The great Christian mystics of medieval times certainly knew that the human mind could be transcended. Saint John of the Cross, who was imprisoned at Toledo in the 16th century, made the idea of transcendence very clear in some verses written after a state of high exaltation. Quote, "The man who truly there has come of his own self must shed the guise of all he knew before the sun seems far beneath that wondrous price. And in this love he grows so wise that he remains, though knowing not, transcending knowledge with his thought. The farther that I climb the high, the less I seem to understand the cloud so tenebrous and grand that there illumines the night. For he who understands that sight remains for aye, though knowing not, transcending knowledge with his thought. This wisdom without understanding is of so absolute a force, no wise man of whatever standing can ever stand against its course, unless they tap its wondrous source. To know so much, through knowing not, they pass all knowledge with their thought. This summit also steeply towers and is of excellence so high, no human faculties or powers can ever to the top come nigh. Whoever with its steep could vie, though knowing nothing, will transcend all thought without end. If you would ask what is its essence, the summit of all sense and knowing, it comes from the divinest presence, the sudden sense of Him overflowing, in His great clemency bestowing the gift that leaves men knowing not, yet passing knowledge with their thought. End quote.
So that, thanks, Miguel. So that poem of St. John of the Cross was translated by Roy Campbell, Poems of St. John of the Cross, the Harble Press Limited. And we'll pick it up next time. Let me just stop the recording.